Amara never imagined her wedding day would feel like the day her life was stolen. The sun shone brightly through the tall windows of the grand hall, but inside her chest a storm raged. Her family's debts had forced her into this marriage, a union with a man she barely knew. As the guests smiled and whispered their congratulations, Amara stood frozen, her hands trembling as she gripped the cold fingers of a stranger. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her like a heavy chain. Her heart pounded, but it wasn't from excitement. It was fear. She stole a glance around the room. Faces blurred together, full of joy that felt false to her. The man beside her smiled politely, but his eyes were distant. He was a stranger bound to her by contract and obligation, not love. Amara's throat tightened. How could they expect her to exchange her freedom for this hollow promise? The priest's voice echoed in the space, but the words floated over her head like distant thunder. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. Her mother stood nearby, eyes shining with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Amara knew this day was not about happiness. It was about survival. Her family's debts threatened to swallow them whole, and this marriage was the only way out. But what about her? Did no one care about the life she dreamed of? The books she loved, the quiet afternoons spent painting, the future she once imagined? All of it seemed like a forgotten story. As the ceremony continued, Amara's gaze fixed on the small bouquet in her hands. The delicate white flowers felt heavy, almost mocking. She remembered the whispered promises of love she once believed in as a child, and now those promises felt like lies wrapped in silk. She wished she could disappear behind the veil, but the veil only covered her face, not her despair. The murmurs of the guests grew louder as the priest declared them married. Applause filled the hall, but Amara's hands refused to release the grip on her husband's hand. It wasn't love. It was a tether holding her captive. As the crowd moved toward the banquet hall, Amara's eyes filled with tears she fought desperately to hold back. She wanted to believe this was just the beginning of a new chapter, but inside, she felt the closing of a door. Later, alone in her room, the silence was suffocating. The grand bed, the expensive curtains, even the ornate mirror, it all felt like a cage. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing with questions no one had asked her. Could she find a way out? Was there someone who could see past the forced smile and tired eyes? Somewhere deep inside, a small spark refused to die, a stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't finished. As night fell, a faint knock echoed through the hall. Amara's heart skipped a beat. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was the stranger who had watched the ceremony from the shadows, his expression unreadable. He approached quietly and held out his hand. "You don't have to stay here if you don't want to," he said softly. Amara blinked, surprised. No one had ever offered her an escape before. She hesitated, the fear still holding her back, but the stranger's eyes held no judgment, only kindness and understanding. For the first time that day, Amara felt seen. Maybe, with this unexpected offer, her life could change. Maybe the chains that bound her could be broken. Her trembling fingers reached out and took his hand. In that moment, everything felt possible again. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of an old clock hanging on the wall. Amara sat by the window, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Outside, the world seemed calm, but inside her heart, a storm was brewing. She was trapped in a life she never chose. The marriage was real now, binding her in ways she couldn't escape with a simple wish or prayer. Her husband's polite smiles were masks hiding a coldness she felt deep in her bones. The grandeur of the mansion felt like a gilded cage. Her thoughts swirled as she stared into the darkness beyond the glass. Every memory of the past days replayed vividly. The forced smiles, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the absence of any word spoken on her behalf. She was invisible, a ghost wandering a life laid out by others. Tears welled up, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had to stay strong. For herself. For a future she wasn't sure she'd ever have. Her phone buzzed softly on the table. It was a message from her sister, a brief note filled with hope and concern. "I'm sorry, Amara. I wish I could help more." Amara's fingers hovered over the screen before she put the phone down. Family was tangled in expectations too, unable to defy the debt or the power that held them all hostage. She was alone in a way that felt colder than the night air. As the hours passed, footsteps echoed down the hall. Her husband entered quietly, his expression unreadable. "You're awake," he said, his voice low and distant. Amara didn't answer. She didn't want to pretend anymore. The man who shared her name by law was a stranger she was expected to trust. She wondered if he felt the same emptiness she did, or if he was simply relieved to have gained what he wanted. He sat beside her, his eyes searching hers. "This isn't what either of us wanted," he said softly. Amara looked away, the truth hitting harder than she expected. It was a confession, an admission that perhaps this forced marriage was a prison for both of them. But did that make it easier? No. It made it more heartbreaking. Two strangers locked in a fate neither wanted, yet neither knew how to escape. The night dragged on, filled with silence, louder than any argument. Amara's mind raced with questions. Could she survive this? Was there a way to reclaim her voice and her life? Somewhere, deep inside, she refused to let despair win. But hope felt fragile, like glass teetering on the edge of a fall. Days turned into weeks. The mansion's walls grew colder, the smiles more forced. Amara's world shrank to the routines she was forced to follow, dressed in fine clothes she didn't choose, attending events where she was expected to smile and remain silent. Yet, beneath the surface, her spirit flickered stubbornly. She started to observe, to listen, to plan. One afternoon, while wandering the estate grounds, she found herself drawn to a quiet garden tucked away behind tall hedges. The flowers were wild and untamed, pushing through cracks in the stone, as if refusing to be controlled. It was there she first noticed the man who had approached her that night. Alexander. He watched from a distance, careful not to startle her. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw something in him that hadn't been there before, a quiet patience, a respect she hadn't known she deserved. Slowly, without words at first, they began to share moments, glances, small smiles, the kind of kindness Amara hadn't experienced in a long time. It was tentative, cautious, but it stirred something in her heart she thought was lost forever. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting a golden light over the garden, Alexander approached her again. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said gently. "I know you're not happy here. I want to help you find a way out." Amara's breath caught. The promise of freedom was intoxicating but terrifying. Trusting someone meant risking heartbreak, but staying meant losing herself. That night, as she lay awake in her gilded cage, she made a silent vow to fight, to survive, to find a way back to herself, no matter the cost. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows of the estate as Amara stood in the hallway, watching the drops trace slow patterns down the glass. The world outside looked peaceful, almost like a painting, but inside her, everything was unraveling. She had spent the past few weeks in quiet desperation, caught between survival and suffocation. Every conversation with her husband felt like a polite performance, every smile a mask that grew heavier by the day. There was no space for her truth, no room for her voice. But now there was him, Alexander. She didn't know why he had shown up that day or what made him notice her pain when no one else did. But he saw her, not as someone's wife or someone's daughter. He saw the fear behind her eyes, the exhaustion in her bones. And in his silence, in his careful glances, there was a kind of understanding she hadn't felt in years. The first time he approached her in the garden, he didn't try to impress her with wealth or words. He simply listened. That alone was a gift she hadn't realized she needed. Every encounter since had been quiet, brief, but powerful. She had learned more about herself in those stolen moments than in the years spent trying to meet everyone else's expectations. That afternoon, as the rain fell, she saw him again. He stood near the iron gate, an umbrella resting on his shoulder. He didn't wave or call out. He just waited, offering the same calm presence that had become her only comfort. Amara stepped outside, letting the chill air sting her skin. It felt real, grounding. "You came back," she said quietly, her voice almost drowned out by the rain. "I said I would," Alexander replied, offering the umbrella. "You don't have to stay in the shadows." She hesitated before stepping closer. "It's not that simple. My family, they depend on this. On me." "And what about you?" he asked gently. "Who's fighting for you?" The question hit harder than she expected. No one had asked her that before, not even herself. They walked slowly through the garden, shielded by the umbrella, the path slick beneath their feet. Alexander didn't pressure her with promises or grand speeches. He spoke like someone who understood what it meant to carry invisible burdens. His own past, though mostly unspoken, had cracks. She could feel it. Maybe that's why he understood her silence so well. "You deserve more than just surviving, Amara," he said softly. "You deserve a life that feels like your own." Those words followed her long after he left that day. That night, she sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her wore fine clothes and flawless makeup, but her eyes were dim. A version of herself she no longer recognized. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who painted sunsets and laughed without fear of consequences. Where had she gone? The next morning, Amara received a letter. No name, no return address. Just a folded note left on her pillow. "If you ever decide to leave, I'll be waiting. Not to rescue you, but to walk beside you when you're ready." Her hands trembled as she held the paper. She didn't know what her next step would be. She didn't know if she had the courage to take it. But for the first time in a long while, she believed she might still have a choice. And the possibility of choice was more powerful than any prison. The letter stayed hidden beneath Amara's pillow for days. She read it over and over, not because she didn't understand its meaning, but because she couldn't believe it was real. No one had ever given her the option to choose. Her whole life had been scripted, decisions made for her, expectations laid out before she could speak. But this small piece of paper held something she had never been offered before. A way out. Her fingers traced the folds of the letter as if they held answers. Each word echoed in her mind, especially the last line. Not to rescue you, but to walk beside you. There was no promise of escape, no fairy tale ending, just a quiet offer of companionship in a world that had always felt so cold. That evening, she stepped out into the garden again. The sky was painted in fading gold and soft gray. The air was still, the kind of stillness that made every sound feel louder. Her footsteps crunched softly against the gravel path as she walked toward the bench where she had last seen him. It was empty. Part of her felt relief. Part of her felt disappointment. "You came," said a voice behind her. She turned. Alexander stood a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, eyes steady and calm. "I wasn't sure if I would," Amara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's all right," he replied. You don't have to decide everything today." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. It was comforting, real. "Everyone keeps telling me this marriage is my duty," she said quietly. "That my family needs it. That I should be grateful." He looked at her, not with pity, but with understanding. Gratitude shouldn't come at the cost of your soul. She let the words settle. She had spent so long convincing herself that her sacrifice was noble. That love could come later. That maybe she didn't need love at all. But sitting beside Alexander now, feeling no pressure to speak or smile or explain herself, she realized how much she had given up just to keep everyone else afloat. "I don't want to be rescued," she said. "I just want to be free." "You're not broken, Amara," Alexander said softly. "You've just been surviving for so long, you forgot what it feels like to live." A lump formed in her throat. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had signed the marriage certificate, the same hands that had trembled on her wedding day. She thought about all the nights she spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was her life now, if the dreams she once held had simply vanished. "I don't know where I go," she admitted. "I have nothing of my own." "You don't need to have everything figured out," he replied. "You just need to take the first step. The rest comes after." She looked up at him. There was no rush in his eyes, no pressure, just patience. For the first time in a long while, she felt the fear begin to loosen its grip on her chest. It didn't disappear, but it softened. And in its place, something else stirred, courage. Small, quiet, unfamiliar. But it was there. "I'm not ready yet," she said honestly. "I know," he replied. "But when you are, I'll be here." As she walked back toward the mansion, the air felt different, lighter. The walls didn't seem as tall. The silence inside didn't echo as loudly. The letter was still under her pillow, but now it wasn't just paper. It was a promise waiting patiently, a reminder that when the time came, she wouldn't have to walk alone. The apartment Alexander brought her to wasn't lavish. It was quiet, simple, and filled with soft morning light that spilled across the wooden floors. For the first time in what felt like forever, Amara woke up in a place where no one expected anything from her. No perfect dress, no rehearsed smiles, just the sound of birds outside the window and the warm scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen. She sat at the small table, wrapping her hands around a plain ceramic mug. The silence was different here. It wasn't heavy. It didn't follow her like a shadow. It gave her space to breathe. Alexander moved around the kitchen without a word, letting her sit in peace. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances. That's what made her trust him even more. "You slept well?" he asked finally, his voice low and calm. She nodded. "Better than I have in months." He smiled, but it was subtle, respectful. There was no celebration in his expression, only quiet understanding. He wasn't trying to fix her. He was giving her time. The days that followed passed slowly. Amara spent her mornings walking through the neighborhood, just to feel the air on her face. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have answers. But she was beginning to feel like herself again, or at least someone closer to who she used to be. She started journaling, sketching small moments that stood out to her. A dog chasing pigeons in the park. An old couple holding hands. The way sunlight warmed her skin in the late afternoon. Sometimes Alexander would join her, but only when she invited him. He never pushed. He never asked about the past unless she brought it up. That made her feel safe. Trust had been broken so many times in her life that even kindness now felt unfamiliar. But with him, it didn't feel like something she owed. It felt like something she was allowed to accept. One night, they sat on the couch watching a quiet film, the kind with long silences and gentle music. Amara leaned back, her feet tucked under her, and felt the ache of healing. Not the pain of leaving, but the slow sting of remembering who she was before everything changed. "I'm not used to this," she said softly, eyes still on the screen. "Used to what?" Alexander asked. "Being around someone who doesn't need me to be anything but myself." He looked at her, thoughtful. "Maybe that's because no one ever gave you the space to figure out who that is." She blinked slowly, the truth of his words settling in her chest. For years, she had been a daughter, a wife, a responsibility, but never just Amara. Never free to define herself without fear of judgment or duty. That night, she opened her journal and wrote a single sentence. Astra's freedom is not loud. It's the quiet permission to be asterisk. There were still moments when doubt crept in. She still woke up some mornings wondering if she had made a mistake. The guilt clung to her like old perfume, faint but persistent. She thought about her family, her name, her past. But each time the fear whispered, Alexander's quiet presence reminded her. He wasn't her escape. He was the first person who didn't try to hold her down. She still didn't know what her future would look like. But for now, she had mornings that belonged to her. She had silence that didn't hurt. And in the soft rhythm of ordinary days, Amara began to rebuild herself, not into what others wanted, but into who she truly was. The morning air was colder than usual, but Amara didn't reach for her shawl. She stood barefoot on the balcony, the chill biting at her skin, but it reminded her she was still here, still feeling, still fighting. Today was different. She didn't know why, but something had shifted inside her. The silence she used to endure now felt unbearable. The house, with all its polished marble and elegant halls, no longer impressed her. It suffocated her. She was done pretending. Downstairs, her husband sat at the long dining table, flipping through the newspaper like he did every morning. His coffee was steaming, his expression, as always, unreadable. Amara stepped into the room, her footsteps firm on the wooden floor. He didn't look up until she pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady. He glanced at her over the rim of his coffee cup, slightly surprised. "About what?" "About this," she said, motioning around the room. "This life. This marriage." He set the cup down carefully. "Is something wrong?" "Everything is wrong," she replied. "This marriage was never about us. It was about debt, image, control." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "And now you want out." "I want to live," she said quietly. "Not like this. Not in a house where I'm nothing more than someone's responsibility." There was a long pause. Then he spoke, his tone colder than the morning air. "You knew what this was from the beginning." "Yes," she said, "but I thought maybe I could endure it. I thought maybe I owed it to my family to suffer quietly. But I've realized I owe myself more." "You're being emotional," he said, brushing her off. "You're not thinking clearly." She stood up. "No, I've never thought more clearly than I do right now." The conversation ended there, not with shouting or drama, but with a heavy silence that followed her as she walked away. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. The decision had already been made. The confrontation was only a formality. Upstairs, she packed a small bag. Not much, just enough to get her through the next few days. She didn't need anything from this house. Every dress, every pair of shoes had been chosen for her. Nothing felt like hers anymore, except for the letter. She tucked it gently into her bag, the paper worn from being read so many times. As she stepped out of the front door, the cold wind swept through her hair. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from freedom. She didn't know where she would go or what tomorrow would look like. But she was finally walking away from something that had drained her spirit. A black car waited at the end of the driveway. She didn't have to ask who sent it. Alexander stood beside it, his coat fluttering slightly in the wind. He didn't move toward her. He waited, giving her the space to make the final step on her own. Their eyes met. Amara walked down the path slowly, each step lighter than the last. When she reached him, she paused. He didn't speak. He didn't offer reassurances. He simply opened the door. She looked back one last time. The mansion loomed behind her, cold and distant. It hadn't been a home. It had been a holding place for a version of her that no longer existed. She got into the car without another word. And as it pulled away from the estate, Amara closed her eyes, letting the silence surround her. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like peace. The knock on the door came just after sunset. Amara had been standing by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life, one by one. The rhythm of her days had finally started to feel normal. She was learning to breathe without guilt, to sleep without fear. But that knock shattered the quiet like a stone through glass. She froze. Alexander looked up from the armchair, his expression shifting the moment he saw her face. Neither of them moved at first. The knocking came again, louder this time. "I'll get it," he said calmly, standing. Amara's heart pounded. She didn't know why, but something felt wrong. She stepped back, out of sight, as Alexander opened the door. A man stood there in a sharp suit, his jaw tight, his tone clipped. "We need to talk to Amara." Alexander didn't move. "Who's asking?" "Family business," the man replied coldly. "Tell her to come out. She knows who sent me." Amara didn't have to see his face to know. Her brother. Or, worse, someone her husband had sent. The life she had escaped from wasn't finished with her. She had hoped silence would protect her, that if she stayed quiet, they'd forget. But now she realized people like them never forget when someone walks away from obedience. Alexander stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Their voices were low, muffled, impossible to follow. Amara pressed her back against the wall, her breath shallow. Every instinct told her to run. But run where? When Alexander came back in, his face was calm, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "They're watching the building," he said quietly. "They want you to come back. They're saying you've embarrassed the family." Amara sat down, her legs suddenly weak. "They're not going to let me go, are they?" "They don't care about what you want," he said gently. "Only what you represent." She nodded slowly. It was always about appearances, always about control. Her leaving had broken a pattern, one they had carefully maintained for years. A quiet wife, a silent daughter. She wasn't allowed to disappear, not without consequences. "What do I do?" she asked. Alexander sat beside her. "You decide if you're ready to stop hiding, to stop running." "I'm scared," she admitted. "So was I once," he said. "But fear isn't the same as weakness. You've already done the hardest part, leaving." That night, Amara didn't sleep. She lay awake thinking about all the ways her life could crumble again. But she also remembered the girl she used to be. The girl who wanted more. Who believed that love should be chosen, not traded. Who believed silence was not the same as peace. In the morning, she made a choice. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She wrote a letter. Not to her husband. Not to her brother. But to the public. To the people who whispered behind closed doors and spread rumors in polished circles. She told the truth. About the marriage. The pressure. The quiet suffering. And why she left. It wasn't revenge. It was liberation. She didn't sign it with her full name. Just her first. Amara. The name she had once been afraid to use without permission. Now, it was her signature of freedom. She clicked send. Alexander looked at her, unsure. "You're sure about this?" She met his eyes. "If they want me to be silent, they'll have to try harder." I'm done living for their comfort. Outside, the city moved on, unaware. But inside that small apartment, something powerful had shifted. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was standing in her truth, no matter who tried to pull her back into the shadows. The fallout came quickly. Within hours of Amara's letter going public, the phones began ringing. Messages poured in, some full of outrage, others of quiet support. The truth had cracked open something deeper than scandal. People were talking. Her story had touched nerves hidden beneath years of silence in families just like hers. Behind the polished smiles and staged photographs, there were others like her, trapped, voiceless, forgotten. Now, they saw someone who had walked away. She sat by the window, watching the clouds gather as thunder rolled low in the distance. She felt strangely calm. For the first time, the fear didn't control her. She had already exposed the truth. They could twist it, deny it, try to silence her again, but they couldn't undo her courage. Alexander walked in holding 2 mugs of tea. His expression was unreadable, but when he handed her the cup, his eyes lingered on hers. "They've issued statement," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Denial." He nodded. "They called it a personal misunderstanding, exaggerated for attention. They're trying to protect the family name." Amara let out a short breath. Not a laugh. Not anger. Just tired understanding. Of course they did. But the world had already read the truth. And some people believed her. That was more than she ever expected. Later that afternoon, there was another knock at the door. This time it wasn't a messenger in a suit. It was her mother. Amara froze. Alexander didn't interfere. He simply nodded, giving her the space to decide. She opened the door, slowly. Her mother stood there, dressed in muted colors, a thin scarf over her hair, and a look that Amara couldn't read. It wasn't rage. It wasn't warmth either. It was something caught between pain and pride. "You look thinner," her mother said, eyes scanning her face. "Are you eating enough?" Amara swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm not starving anymore. That's what matters." They sat at the small table inside. Her mother glanced around the apartment, clearly not used to its simplicity, but said nothing about it. "You didn't have to make it public," she said after a pause. "If I didn't, no one would have believed me," Amara replied. "You know that." Her mother's eyes shimmered with something unspoken. "Your father hasn't left the house. Your brother won't speak to me." "I didn't write it for them," Amara said, her voice soft but firm. "I wrote it for me, and for every woman who never got the chance." Her mother looked away, blinking hard. "Do you think I had a choice when I married your father? Do you think I wanted this life for you?" Amara felt the ache rise in her chest, but she held it back. "Then why didn't you fight for me?" "I was trying to survive," her mother whispered. "So am I," Amara replied. "But I chose a different way." There was a long silence. Then her mother stood up. "You're stronger than I ever was." She didn't say goodbye. She just walked out, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and decades of quiet regret. That night, Amara stood by the window again. Rain began to fall, soft and steady. Alexander joined her, standing silently by her side. "You did it," he said. "No," she whispered. "I started it." The journey ahead was still uncertain. The world hadn't changed overnight, but Amara had. She had taken back her name, her voice, her life. Not with noise, not with revenge, but with truth. And this time, no one could take that from her.